Hi, it's Terry Gross, host of Fresh Air. Hey, take a break from the 24-hour news cycle with us and listen to long-form interviews with your favorite authors, actors, filmmakers, comedians, and musicians, the people making the art that nourishes us and speaks to our times. So listen to the Fresh Air podcast from NPR and WHYY.
This week, Elon Musk announced he has merged his rocket company, SpaceX, with his AI company, xAI. And the reason? He wants to build AI data centers in space. But his company is not the only one that wants to take the cloud off the planet.
This moment right here,
Star Cloud 1, separation confirmed,
could represent the birth of an entirely new industry, data centers in space.
AI is taking over more and more of our lives, from our shopping queries to the search for a cancer cure. And all that data processing requires massive data centers that are sucking up power here on Earth.
But things are different in space.
In space, you've got continuous solar. You actually don't need batteries because it's always sunny in space.
That's the dream.
Yes.
That's the dream.
Various companies from Google to Blue Origin to smaller startups are looking to Earth's orbit as the next data center frontier.
And companies in Seattle are leading the charge.
I'm Joshua McNichols.
And I'm Monica Nicholsberg. This is Booming.
Today, how close are we to actually putting data centers in space? And why would you want to? That's coming up.
To infinity and beyond!
Monica, I want to take you into space in a minute, but real quick, you've been covering data centers on Earth and how companies are racing to build them. So just to set the stage, can you remind us what's driving that push?
Sure. So I did some reporting a while back on the data centers in central Washington. There's a ton of hydropower there, and so it's really created this data center boom for the past 20 years in the area. And these are data centers that process pretty much everything we do on the internet and on our phones. But now, AI is driving a lot of this need for more data centers. And there's a growing backlash from communities that are worried about how much energy and water and land these places gobble up.
Okay, that brings us to what I'm reporting on this week. So now, instead of giant data centers on Earth, imagine giant clusters of data centers within satellites orbiting the Earth and communicating with each other using lasers.
Okay, I just finished reading Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and as somebody who is not that interested in space, she really painted a picture that made me care about it. So maybe you can do the same thing with these data centers. Like, what do they look like?
Well, in the future, the expectation is that there'll be, kind of like these big boxes that are full of servers, and maybe they'll be arranged along a spine that provides, all their power. And the power comes from these giant solar arrays that are constantly capturing the sun's energy.
Wow, very sci-fi.
Yeah, definitely. And Google wants them by 2027.
That's crazy. That's in like 2 years. 1 year. It's 2026.
Yeah. Ever since I heard these were a thing, I've had a lot of questions. Most of my questions were technical. But I spoke with someone who showed me this isn't just an engineering problem. They're not just trying to figure out how to build and maintain these satellites. There are other questions about humans, like who gets to send these big industrial, things up into space? And will humans ever learn to clean up our messes up there? And it turns out Seattle could play a surprisingly central role in all this.
It sounds like you found someone really interesting. Who did you talk to?
Yeah, the person I talked to was Dr. Sadia Pekkanen. She's a professor at the University of Washington, and she's the founding director of the Space Law, Data, and Policy program at the UW Law School. And she writes a blog called the Space Diplomacy Newsletter. It is such a specific focus, isn't it?
Yes, it is a very specific focus. And the rise of diplomacy in space is also something that is getting a lot more attention now, given the geopolitical moment that we're in.
Yeah. Sadia, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
There's various companies from startups to big tech that have been discussing this idea of putting data centers in space. Mm-hmm. Why would companies want to put data centers in space in the first place?
I think that's a great question to start with. These data processors, these data centers require a massive amount of energy to run. And because these processors get very hot, they also need a lot of water and fans to keep them cooled down. What happens is that they also get caught up in the politics. They generate a lot of noise, pollution, and take up water and electricity resources from the local community. So for all those three reasons, there is an emphasis on thinking that, well, if we could be closer up in orbit, the sun can be the main source for powering these centers. And then because these orbital data centers simply radiate their heat out into the cold vacuum of space, they don't need to be cooled down. So both those costs go down to zero. And then finally, there's no politics up there. There's no communities shouting that there is, some sort of negative impact on the communities that are around these centers. So for all those reasons, what we see is that there is this emphasis on trying to lift out of the terrestrial context and into orbit.
Hearing about these companies wanting to sort of avoid the politics on the ground and avoid all these other constraints like the need to cool them, it reminds me of, tech companies in general and tech entrepreneurs in general talk about space a lot. They talk about sort of getting off Earth and getting to these new places like Mars where, maybe they can form this sort of idealized version of what they imagine a colony might look like. It just strikes me as there's a sort of similarity there, this idea of like, let's just get off Earth and some of these problems might go away.
Yes. And I think what we need to remember is that nowhere that humans go will we be able to escape the gravity of politics. That's just not going to happen. And so I think regardless of whether we're talking about orbital data centers or settlements on the moon or settlements on Mars, politics will follow if people are there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How close are we to this actually happening?
So there's a company right here in Seattle that's called StarCloud. And it is the first company in the world to demonstrate and I think make viable the idea of orbital data centers.
What did they do that has revealed this?
What they did was that they sent up a variant of Google's Gemini called Gemma, which was actually able to communicate with people on the ground.
So it's like an AI up there in the satellite that they can ask questions to, and
that's exactly right.
Give them an answer.
Yeah, it's just like Google Gemini or ChatGPT, except that it's sort of sensing what's on Earth, and you can kind of ask. And it says very interesting things like I'm right now over Africa. In 20 minutes, I'll be in the Middle East. Then you can kind of ask questions like that.
Oh, so it knows where it is in space.
Yes. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. I wonder what else it can tell us about ourselves from its perch up there. How important is the greater Seattle area when it comes to this race to put data centers in space?
So as I said, because StarCloud is the first to sort of demonstrate the possibility of AI processing for data centers in space, Seattle is at the forefront of what is possible. In fact, I would say that Seattle has made possible the idea that orbital data centers are viable.
Wow, just because of StarCloud?
Just because of StarCloud.
When I talk to companies that have new technologies, oftentimes they'll tell me the reason they're here is the workforce. You've got people who can build things physically with their hands, engineers, people who worked at Boeing and all the many companies that provide things for Boeing, and also, software engineers and people who know a lot about AI. You've got all these things coming together. So how important are these ingredients to what could grow beyond, one company?
Yeah, so I think that technical or technological history is sort of destiny. The reason why I think tech companies build on the layer of what Boeing sort of built, the aerospace workforce to sort of build really over a century, sort of think about this. That talent pool, those supply chains, those machinists, those tool makers, those engineers, they're sort of layered into the making of Seattle as a space hub. And, we of course hear about the big companies. So you hear about Blue Origin, you hear about SpaceX, but there are, close to at least 90 or so companies that are sort of involved in the space ecosystem in Seattle. And You may not hear about them, but they're the foundational infrastructure on which many of these technologies are built. You go to Washington, D.C., and they forget that there is this Washington that is really, in my opinion, second only to space as a frontier. I do think it's really at the cutting edge of space technology, data, and policy going forward in a way that other jurisdictions are not. And now I think what is also changing and I think sort of rising to the surface is that in a significant way, Seattle has been given a great deal in terms of this historical advantage, this technical advantage, this engineering advantage. And to whom much is given, much is also expected. So I think Seattle now has to sort of step up to the plate and sort of begin the responsible stewardship of how we actually do things in a way that's not harmful, in a way that's helpful to the community. And I think that ethos is also built into the thinking of the workforce here.
What's the strongest argument against the idea of data centers in space?
One, of course, is that they're experimental, so we have to wait and see whether they come into being. But another is that if the reality matches the hype, we're talking about the proliferation of mega constellations into yet another orbit around the planet. And
mega constellations of data center satellites.
Yes, it could very well be, right? So whenever we have so many objects in space, we all still have to worry about orbital debris, which is a problem. Sort of think about this as plastic in the ocean, sort of debris in the sky. And the fact that it's moving around so fast that eventually collisions, accidents are beginning to be a real possibility in space. And the more of these satellites that are up there, the more likely it is that you will get something like the Kessler effect. And you can sort of
Kessler effect?
Yeah, so think of that like a domino effect. If it crashes into one, it will crash into another, and then it sort of spins out of control.
Yeah, because once you have a collision, it's no longer just two objects that are clogging up the space field. It's now all the parts that broke off of it.
Yes.
Each of which becomes their own
little
potential.
Bullet.
Yeah,
exactly. Each of them becomes like a little bullet projectile whizzing around at these lethal speeds that can hurt machines as much as they can hurt humans.
When I've looked at the space industry in this area, it's also sort of like the Silicon Valley of weird space companies, and there are companies that are just devoted to like dealing with debris in space. For example, there's one that has this sort of claw where it wants to grab a satellite that's no longer working and without creating a large debris field, pull it into low Earth orbit where it would eventually disintegrate in the atmosphere.
Yeah, and I think I can point to another company in Seattle that has sort of just gotten, I think, the first end-of-life contract to sort of demonstrate that technology. And it's able to service those satellites. I believe it's also able to potentially deorbit those satellites. And so the servicing of these satellites in space already, end-of-life extension, end-of-life removal, it is a very important industry too.
Let's stick with the thought experiment right now about just in-space collisions. If a collision were to occur, like how would that change life on Earth? Do we have to worry about parts of satellites falling on our heads?
Not yet, but you might have to. Objects fall out of the orbit every day. The reason why you don't hear about it is because, most of the planet is water. We have fortunately not had any huge accidents like that, but pieces are beginning to sort of fall out of the sky in remote areas and have been doing that for decades. The fear is that this may accelerate as mega constellations go into space. The bigger fear is that if this happens, what do we do? What do we do?
We don't have a space environmental organization or like a space cleanup crew.
So we have the cleanup crews that you already mentioned. So companies are thinking about deorbiting, getting rid of the space debris, but we don't have rescue operations like that. So we do have systems in place that give conjunction warnings, but now we're in a situation where many countries have different conjunction warnings, and we don't have a coordinated mechanism for believing who's right and who is wrong about those conjunction warnings.
So I think you've answered my next question, which was who regulates those data centers? There's no global space government right now.
No. But, we have international law that is at a very, very, very broad general level. But I think, as novel activities and technologies come into play, it would help, not just companies in the U.S. or not just the U.S. itself, but really its partners around the world to sort of sit down and begin to think about, what are the mechanisms that we need to put in place to avoid precisely those scenarios. Because in any kind of a scenario in which space assets are involved, the U.S. is the biggest loser because the U.S. is the most dependent, most space dependent. Our civil, commercial, and military realities all run in and through space. So it's very important for the U.S. government, for the U.S. military to ensure that those assets remain safe and secure for the country as a whole.
It almost sounds like we're becoming more vulnerable when we put more of our assets in space. I mean, we already depend on satellites for GPS navigation, weather forecasting, military communications, you name it.
I think that that's exactly right. And no one is more vulnerable than the United States because we are the most space-dependent country in the world. And the way that our entire space economy is moving, the United States is a juggernaut. Part of the juggernaut is right here in the Seattle, the greater Seattle innovation ecosystem. And so this is why I say you can't just, put an orbital data center in space. You can't just dream about putting AI in space. You have to put that in the context of what is actually happening globally for the safety and security of those assets. It's naive to imagine that you can now get about and move into space uninterrupted and free.
What's next? What's the next stage of this idea that you're watching, and what are you watching for?
I think here's what I'm watching for. I am very excited to see the technologies come into place. But what I am excited about also is the space diplomacy that must inevitably follow. And so I run here in Seattle something called the Space Diplomacy Symposium every year. And we're hoping to bring together civil, commercial, and military stakeholders on an annual basis here on out and to provide solutions potentially for exactly the kinds of scenarios that you were thinking about and that we were discussing earlier. So, as I said, I think Seattle now has a special duty and responsibility just because of the amazing concentration of space capabilities that we have to sort of layer in that piece so that we can all continue to use space as we move ahead in the future.
So in the same way that the United Nations helps, theoretically at least, keep nations from, stepping over boundaries and taking each other over, doesn't always work. Similarly, we could end up with a United Nations-like organization based in Seattle that, draws on the industry knowledge here, but also just because this is such an important center.
I would love that. I would love that. And I think that's sort of the goal of the Space Diplomacy Symposium is to bring those stakeholders together every year to order to help be part of the solution as we move forward for space to be secure and safe for everyone.
Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure to engage.
In a small corner of Washington state, there's a group of ranchers from the Kalispel tribe, the Buffalo Boys. Years ago, members of the tribe would migrate hundreds of miles to the Great Plains to hunt buffalo, but that was cut off. Now, they have a herd of their own. I'm Chris Morgan. Join me on The Wild as we tell the story of how they got these buffalo and what they're doing to make sure they'll forever be a part of their lives. Listen to The Wild with Chris Morgan on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.
This was fascinating. I loved this interview. It did leave me wondering, how close are we to this becoming a reality?
Yeah, well, you've got that one prototype that's up there now. It's basically just a dumb box up there. Well, I shouldn't say dumb. It's
a smart box.
Yeah, exactly. But, eventually they want to scale it up to this bigger model. Google wants to have them up there in 2027. But in terms of how close we are, there's a couple of things that have to happen. The cost of sending things up in rockets has to go down far enough that it's economically viable for a company like StarCloud to send bigger and bigger things up there. You know, the first one they sent already is like a box just floating in space, but I imagine at some point they'll get much larger, like maybe the size of shipping containers full of lots of servers.
Okay, next year seems like a crazy timeline to me, but it sounds like they're on the path. Do you know if they've figured out how they're going to service these data centers? Because I know here on Earth, the servers need to be replaced every couple of years. But I don't know, is there going to be like a data center technician astronaut job that's created here?
Yeah, I actually don't know the answer to that question, but I'm imagining that a lot of this process will be automated. These things do deteriorate over time. I mean, there's this problem with just cosmic radiation, which is everywhere in space, and you can try to shield these things against it, but random particles do get through and they corrupt the code. They do something called flipping bits, which basically means when a particle passes through the chip, it can change zeros to ones or ones to zero, and that just, corrupts the information. When a certain percentage of those chips are bad, then that module would no longer be useful, and maybe they'll just eject it.
Well, I'm sure solving all of these problems is some engineer somewhere's dream. I personally can't wait till the day that we're storing all of our booming episodes in space. Thanks for bringing us this truly wild story.
Yeah, no problem. That is all for Booming this week. Thanks for listening.
We're still working on a story about where all of the laid-off tech workers have ended up. So if you've been laid off from a tech company in the past couple of years, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at booming@kuow.org or leave us a voicemail at 206-221-7158.
And this podcast is part of a public radio station. We depend on the community for support. So if you want to support the show, you can donate at kuow.org/booming. And thanks.
Our producers are Lucy Suchek and Alec Cowan. Our editor is Carol Smith. I'm Monica Nicholsberg.
I'm Joshua McNichols.
And we'll catch you next time.
Are you dreading increasingly shorter days and longer nights? Do cold, overcast northwest winters bum you out? You may be suffering from the big dark, but there is a solution. I'm Dyer Oxley, telling you to talk to your podcast app about Meet Me Here, KUOW's arts podcast, a weekly dose of events and culture to lighten up your life. Side effects of Meet Me Here include laughter, curiosity, and inspiration. Find Meet Me Here on your local KUOW app or wherever you get your podcast.